We arrived in Rome exactly a week ago. A bustling, vibrant metropolis, complete with people toting cell phones. In fact, wherever we looked, Romans were roaming. And roaring mopeds that seemed to have taken the place of the chariots of ancient Rome, driven, in my imagination, with identical bravado. Not to mention the racy, heart-stopping ads for American merchandise that would stop traffic in the US. After a meal and a much-needed siesta, we set out to do some sightseeing. Our first stop, the Trevi Fountain. Legend has it that tossing a coin into the fountain guarantees a return to the Eternal City. We then took a bus to the Gianiculum Hill across the Tiber River, where Giuseppe Garibaldi defeated the forces of the Pope in 1870, an ideal spot from which to soak in a panoramic view of Rome by night. Our plan was to depart the next morning to continue on to Pisa, Florence and Venice, and to then return here for the last few days of our stay before flying back to Boston. We left Roma Termini next morning, heading out to Pisa along the Tyrrhenian coast. The vegetation seemed distinctly tropical, a fact not missed on Anasuya.
Now sitting in a train on our way from Rome to Pisa. It's a nice experience being in a train with the kind of with the setting the way it is, because everything outside looks very Indian, or getting close to Indian, not really. It's a nice day out there, sunny and cloudy.
Both together.
Both together. At least it's not raining.
Not yet.
Not yet.
The dazzling Piazza del Duomo with a leaning belfry, the site of Galileo's famous experiments with objects in motion. It has been leaning since its inception in 1174, and it slips about a millimetre every year. Some say that its builder Bonanno intended it to lean. Efforts have been going on ever since to keep it standing, though not many options remain now, other than tilting the rest of Italy. The food in Italy is simply grand. How do they make their pizza and their salad so different and so heavenly? It's at times like these that I'm completely ready to forgive the Italians for inventing the opera. The combination of our jet lag, and the food and drink in our tummies, and the rumble of the Eurostar Italia made it hard for us to stay awake as we sped southeast through the Tuscan countryside toward Florence.
What time? It's 10, let's go.
The Palazzo Vecchio stands over the Piazza della Signoria, Florence's civic centre for over 500 years. This fortress-like palace belonged to the Medici family. Armanati's Fountain of Neptune, much maligned by Michelangelo, is a permanent fixture since 1575. A replica of Michelangelo's David still seems to protect Florence from the bigger Goliath-like enemies. Back in the early 1500s, it was the neighbouring kingdoms that routinely attacked this beleaguered city-state. Now he seems to need new enemies. Perhaps the euro would fit the bill. The original has been moved to the Academy Gallery in the 19th century. The Loggia dei Lanzi is an open-air gallery of sculptures depicting violent and arguably misogynistic scenes. The legacy of the Renaissance is no small burden for Florentines. Today's artists often work under the watchful eyes of past masters. Located here is an exquisite collection of art called the Uffizi Galleries, literally the office galleries of the Medici dukes. Here we saw some of the most beautiful works of art ever in the original. Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus and the Allegory of Spring from the 1400s, Leonardo da Vinci's Annunciation, Verrocchio's Baptism of Jesus, in which Da Vinci, then a 14-year-old apprentice, painted one of the angels. And finally, a peek at Florentine family values. The Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, with its bell tower designed by Giotto, and its dome or Duomo designed by the architect, artist and mathematician Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi built the dome without the aid of modern instruments and techniques. Exactly how he did it is the subject of much research and speculation, as he destroyed the designs. Around 1420, in typical Florentine style, there was a competition for the contract. It was to go to whoever could get an egg to stand straight on a table. Brunelleschi achieved this by cracking the bottom of the egg. When his rivals protested that they could have done the same, he replied with characteristic immodesty that they could also build the dome if only he showed them how. The Ponte Vecchio, literally the old bridge, is the only medieval ponte that still spans the Arno River. A bitterly retreating Nazi army blew up all the rest. Once a spot for hog butchers to sell their goods, it was converted to a site for gold and silversmiths to sell everything from jewellery to poison rings. Old man Cosimo de' Medici simply didn't care for the smell of pigs' intestines assaulting his nostrils on his way to work. This then became a place also to mingle and relax, and perhaps a spot for the likes of Cellini to drop the chisel to come and savour an afternoon cappuccino. It remains an excellent spot today to install and decompress oneself after a breathless dose of sightseeing and history. Wayfaring musicians regale you for your spare lira, much as they did Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. I could have sworn I had seen this ensemble in Boston the week before. We splurged on a first-class ticket to Venice. The plush interior hardly belied the fact that we were cutting across Tuscany and Emilia-Romagna into Veneto at 120 miles per hour. All of this capped with a gourmet dinner right on the train. The show wasn't Amtrak. The water buses, called the Vaporetti, have taken the place of the gondolas of the yore. They are the modern means of navigating the Grand Canal from the Santa Lucia train station to the stop at San Zaccaria near our hotel.
Yes?
Just need your passports.
Okay, alright.
An equestrian statue of Vittorio Emanuele oversees the Piazzetta San Marco, the heart of the city in its heyday of seafaring glory. Venetians call the lagoon the Serenissima, the most serene. Gone are the roaring mopeds of Rome and Florence. Situated here is the Doge's palace, Doge being the Venetian word for a duke, the all-powerful magistrate of the city. The library, built by Sansovino, houses a rare collection of 15th century books and the Archaeological Museum of Venice. It also offers a grand aerial view of Venice and the nearby island of San Giorgio Maggiore. Upon two granite columns stand Santo Daro, the original patron saint of Venice, and the winged lion representing Saint Mark. They dominate the Piazzetta San Marco, once the site of legendary public executions. The Piazza San Marco, housing the old and new courts, got its finishing touches from the Emperor Napoleon. Ever since the remains of Saint Mark were smuggled in from Egypt in the 9th century, he became the new patron saint of Venice. A direct disciple of the Apostle Saint Peter, he now rests in the Byzantine Basilica di San Marco.
Sulla testa! No, metti sul cappello! Anto, metti sul cappello, sennò la mamma non vuole. Sì, vieni qui dalla mamma, metti sul cappello.
The Grand Canal is to Venice what the Champs-Élysées is to Paris. Here you see firsthand all the canonical views of Venice as painted by Canaletto, Tintoretto and many other artists since. The splendid Fondaco dei Turchi was the headquarters of Turkish merchants. Halfway to the Santa Lucia station is the Rialto Bridge, originally built in 1440. The current version was completed by Antonio da Ponte in 1592. Even Michelangelo and Sansovino had competed fiercely for the commission. A stellar example of Venetian Gothic, the Cadoro, seems delicate enough to float in its own reflection from the front, but it goes 50 yards deep and houses the bounteous Franchetti Art Gallery. Anasua was a bit upset about the high price I'd promised a gondolier, $150 for a 30-minute ride. She had a point. Adjusted for distance or time, it was more expensive than our flight from Boston.
Orange juice without San Pellegrino.
The gondolier took us first to the Bridge of Sighs, named after the laments of the accused who were dragged across it to the prison. They all faced certain torture and possible death. In Shakespeare's tale, Othello was probably brought here following Desdemona's murder. I started to wonder where the bard got his fascination for Venice. At least 3 of his plays are based here, not to speak of other parts of what is Italy today. Did he ever travel to this country? Perhaps during the lost years, between his marriage in 1582 and his appearance in London as a playwright in 1592. His activities during that decade are virtually unknown, and some say he might have travelled to Italy. Venice was booming during that time, and might well have drawn him inexorably. A word about the gondolier. His highly romanticized job is in fact a tough one. Among other things, there are the daily taunts and jeers of the locals. He transports you not only through the canals, but to another point in time, and though not cheap, he has to make lira while the sun shines. The first whiff of wintry weather closes business until spring. One of the most abiding landmarks of Venice is the Church of Santa Maria della Salute. Its construction was started in 1631 as an offering to the Virgin when a plague ended, hence the name Salute. The commission went to the Venetian master Baldassare Longhena, who toiled on it for half a century, but, sadly, died 5 years before its completion. The painting of the Madonna e Bambino dates back to the 15th century. Alongside is a 16th century bronze candle stand. The greatest works of art are in the large sacristy. The Wedding at Cana by Tintoretto, signifying Jesus' first display of a miracle. And Saint Mark enthroned by Titian, dating from 1510. This evening, we were in for a truly unexpected treat. We found out that the Chiesa di Santa Maria della Pieta, next to our hotel, was the venue where Antonio Vivaldi used to teach music to a group of orphan girls that were called the Putte Veneziane. They became such accomplished violinists that they were considered by some to have surpassed the virtuosos in Paris. The regulations of the time prevented them from performing more widely, but the very fact that this ensemble had women in it was extraordinary in and of itself. This evening, a local choir called Le Putte Veneziane di Vivaldi were going to pay homage to the maestro in period costumes with their recital of the Concerto alla Rustica. Our stay in Venice was over. Quite reluctantly, we had to pack our bags and head back to Rome. There were people on the Vaporetto that looked dressed up for work like anywhere else. Commuters probably to nearby Mestre or Padua. It seemed almost incongruous that residents of a place of such ethereal beauty have to bother with such mundane matters as work. Anasuya was planning out our itinerary in Rome, but at the back of our minds there was a worry. The Italian railway workers were going on strike. This meant that the train could grind to a halt at any time in the middle of the journey. Surely all roads led to Rome, but this was small comfort if we had to walk it. In the end, we did make it safely to Rome. That coin we tossed in the Trevi fountain really did the trick. Originally built 27 years before the birth of Christ by Marcus Agrippa, Caesar Augustus' son-in-law, the Pantheon has survived over 2,000 years. Its present form reflects the expansion by Hadrian in 120 AD, with the original bronze doors. There is a wide opening at the top to let out the smoke from pagan rituals involving animal sacrifices, and a hole on the floor for drainage. It now houses the tombs of prominent Italians such as Vittorio Emanuele and Raphael. Indeed, the latter's fans still bring him flowers. In Rome, do as Romans do, goes the old saying. Perhaps looking at worn-out maps and letting your cappuccino get cold is not the done thing. It tended to produce odd reactions. The Spanish Steps are adjacent to the house in which Keats died in 1821. It now houses the Keats Shelley Museum, Shelley having drowned nearby with a copy of Keats in his pocket. The Spanish Steps, designed by an Italian, funded by the French, occupied by the British, and named after the Spanish, are a cosmopolitan happening place. They overlook Via Condotti, the main shopping district of Rome. It is a great spot for people watching, sitting by a fountain designed by Pietro Bernini in 1629. Anasuya wanted to get some rest at the hotel. I set out on my own to visit Piazza Navona and then to go on to St. Peter's by night to see if the lights were still on in the abode of the Pope Giovanni Paolo. Piazza Navona is distinguished for its Baroque masterpieces such as the Fountain of the Four Rivers. It was sculpted by Giovanni Lorenzo Bernini in 1651. He's not to be confused with his father Pietro Bernini, whose fountain we saw near the Spanish Steps. This fountain, sculpted by the more famous Sonny Boy, represents the four great rivers of the world, the Ganges, the Danube, the La Plata and the Nile. Romans come here to unwind and pour their hearts out to each other. Perhaps these folks are saving megabucks in therapy compared to their American cousins. It was dark with a slight drizzle when I arrived at St. Peter's Basilica. The colonnades, designed by Bernini Jr., signifying the long arms of the Mother Church, looked grand and all-encompassing. The basilica itself was undergoing maintenance work. It was time to head back to the hotel to catch some shut-eye. Next morning, we took the metro back to Ottaviano San Pietro, to the Vatican Museum. Amid many beautiful works of art in the Vatican Museum, my favorite was the School of Athens in one of Raphael's stanze. It depicts the philosophers from the ages, such as Aristotle, Plato and Socrates. Many of these are actually portraits of Renaissance artists. Bramante as Euclid, Raphael himself looking at you from a corner. A dejected Michelangelo sits to one side of the stairs. Plato in the middle and pointing upwards is actually a likeness of Leonardo da Vinci. Directions were not always very clear, but we found the Sistine Chapel. Unfortunately, no cameras were allowed inside. I could only tape the reproductions outside, some of my favorite Michelangelo paintings. In particular, The Last Judgment, dominated by Christ the Judge, very controversial in its time due to its emphasis on anatomical detail. The chosen are going to heaven on the left, and the damned are being hauled off to hell on the right. Now we stood near the world's best-known sports stadium and the most recognizable symbol of Rome, the Colosseum. Called the Amphitheatrum Flavium, it was commissioned by Vespasian in 72 AD. Ravaged by an earthquake and used as a quarry for churches and palaces in the Middle Ages, it was finally saved from total destruction by a benediction from the Pope. 50,000 spectators once sat here and enjoyed the sights of gladiators pitted against each other or against wild animals in all sorts of permutations. Some of the victims were Christians, brought here to face certain death for their faith, though this claim has been disputed lately. The Colosseum could be flooded with water for mock naval battles, hence the name amphitheatre. You can still see where the senators sat. Seating was by social status and gender. Underneath a wooden floor, now stripped away, lay a complex of cages and tunnels where the wild animals were kept before the fights. A teacher from France had brought a busload of school children. I listened on to her impromptu history lesson with interest.
Revenu, il utilisait sa pique pour le renvoyer au milieu. Au départ, les gladiateurs c'était des esclaves. Ça n'a pas été toujours des esclaves. Parce qu'à certains moments, si vous voulez, il y a la gloire quand même de ça. Mais c'est vrai que certains, voilà, c'est devenu un métier. Certaines personnes, même des gens libres, vont faire le métier de gladiateur parce que c'est un petit peu comme les gens qui aiment faire du théâtre. C'est une sorte de passion et on n'explique pas. C'est qui peut coûter la vie effectivement, mais en contrepartie, si on gagne, on a la gloire et tout. Bon, c'est vrai qu'il y a quelque chose.
The Arch of Constantine commemorates Emperor Constantine's victory over the pagan Maxentius in 306 AD. Visions of a cross during the battle led the emperor to adopt Christianity. Within 60 years, it became the only legal religion of Rome, quite a reversal from throwing Christians to rabid wild animals in the past. Via dei Fori Imperiali, constructed by Mussolini in an urge to associate with the glory of ancient Rome. In this city, the past intrudes relentlessly into the present, sometimes in the most unexpected ways.
Automatic.
Yes, things have changed, you see, from the Roman Empire. Now,
Okay.
camera, drink,
Very
automatic.
nice.
Ave Caesar.
Ave.